Welcome, everyone. And for those of you who are going to be watching in the future, our guest today for our lunchtime lecture is the wonderful, awesome, powerful force of nature, Gabrielle Jackson, which I don't know that I've ever called you Gabrielle. I think I've always called you Gabby. But today, Gabby is going to be here. Normally when she visits us, it's always with a song or performance. And but today we're going to be highlighting the work that she's doing with something called Joy Jackson Initiative. And she's going to be specifically sharing with us about her work in racial equality in theater and performance. Now, Gabby, my first question for you is, well, the theater has a reputation of being this wonderfully liberal place where everybody's accepted and, you know, come as you are. And and if I'm understanding this correctly, that is not true.
No, in plain language, theater is racist, sexist, homophobic, and has a lot of other, and ableist, has a lot of other isms that go along with it. I like to use plain language. I don't use coded language at all. I will always speak plainly. So I think coded language is one of those things that keeps us, that's a barrier to entry for folks understanding the ins and outs of what equity, diversity, and inclusion actually are and what they actually mean. So for me, it's very important to use plain terms. So just as a word of warning to everybody, an activation warning, today we might talk about some things that touch places in you that cause you to feel activated, whether positively or negatively. Anytime I open or facilitate space, I just like to give an activation warning to let people know that those things will be touched upon. We're going to be using plain language. We're going to be using data, all sorts of things to really clearly illustrate the inequity that happens inside of the theater space. If you feel any sort of activation, I encourage you to take a moment, breathe, and understand that this isn't an attack. This isn't intended to hurt feelings. This is only intended to expose and illuminate truth. So I encourage you to take a deep breath, recognize that it's not personal, and let that be a moment to start your own understanding of where you might be coming from on some of these subjects.
Can I ask you, just so we're all in using the same language, can you define what coded language means?
Absolutely. Coded language in plain speak is just saying something while you mean something else. One of my favorite examples to use is I'm an actor and I'm a Black actor. And one of the things that people will say to avoid saying Black or any derogatory terms that come along with Blackness is they'll say urban. Most recently and notably, Zoe Kravitz was just told the media that she lost out on the Batman franchise originally when Anne Hathaway played Catwoman because she was told by the director that she was too urban. So the director was really saying she was too Black. So coded language is saying one thing and meaning another and trying to say that other offensive thing in the most easily disguised way possible in order to kind of gaslight people. Honestly, it's kind of a dangerous and really prejudicial practice, because when we say things like urban and you call out the racism inside of that, like I just have done, right? Clearly, I saw people's faces in the room go, ooh, you know, and it is alarming and shocking, right? But when we say urban, it's easy to brush that off and say, well, he wasn't saying that she was too Black. Maybe he was saying that, you know, she had too much of a streetwise quality to play Catwoman, and he was looking for someone more elegant, upscale. Elegant and upscale is also a coded way of saying white. So this language happens all around us, right? Same with things like saying differently abled instead of people with disabilities, right? that kind of coded language follows us everywhere we go and through every marginalized community, and can sometimes masquerade and disguise itself as being positive or uplifting, when in actuality it's derogatory and horrific, in my opinion, in the opinion of many others as well.
So in your work, first of all, tell us about the birth of Joy Jackson Initiative and its purpose, where you started and where you are now.
Absolutely. So in 2020, there was a lot of racial unrest after the murders of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery, and the racist violence that ensued during the protest period, during the time when a lot of people were activated and standing up for racial justice, and specifically standing up in favor of the Black Lives Matter movement. Personally, I can sense when things are all talk and no action, because I've been Black for 28 years of my life. So it's very easy to spot allyship and performance. And so I was very frustrated with the performative nature of the theater community, performative nature of the theater community. And specifically some of my elders and some of the people who I felt had, really given me a lot of opportunity, and I thought I could trust and really look up to during this time. And one particular instance, I made a Facebook post about just how frustrated I was with the silence of the theater community after so many murders of Black individuals. And I was really upset because just months before we had been talking about slowing the spread, how all lives have value and how we have to stick together to save lives, right? And so in the face of murder and racial injustice, I was confronted with the fact that only when those lives included the lives of white people were we in an uproar, were we actively making moves to, as a theater community, to uplift and uphold one another. And so I became extremely frustrated, and it all started with a Facebook post, because Twitter fingers often turn into trigger fingers, as Drake says.
I love that. That is so true.
It's true, right? And so I posted something just kind of calling in a very direct way, some of the leadership of the Orange County and Los Angeles theater community. And I was threatened. I was told that it's possible that no one would want to hire me, that I have to be careful about what I say, which obviously made me want to talk louder and be a little more activated.
And so in other words, they were saying, keep in your place.
Absolutely. Stay in your lane. I am, as they say, broccoli. I am garnish, right? I am the parsley on the plate. And so I was told essentially to shut up and dribble. But I guess for theater, that would be shut up and stand in the light where you're supposed to.
Do your
right?
blocking. Do your
exactly.
blocking.
Shut up and do your blocking. And I was blocked to take racist injustice quietly. And I decided that I didn't want that to be the direction for the play of my life if we're going to continue with this metaphor. And I decided to do something. So this one particular person, I had worked at their theater company pretty repeatedly. And so I wrote down 100 instances of racial injustice that had happened to me, both micro and macro aggressions, just from my experiences in the Orange County area. And a lot of those experiences were at that company. And I had either borne witness to them or been a direct victim of these experiences. And so essentially I was like, I was going to make this, a very petty, here, answer this questionnaire, because I already know the answers, and I know a lot of them have happened under your watch. And are you aware of this? And kind of use it as a tool to bring light to the instances that had happened in my own life, and really make it clear to this one individual how important it is to continue to have these conversations surrounding racial justice. And thankfully, some people from my circle grabbed me and were like, hey, girl, this is actually a tool that you can use more for your petty than for your petty devices. It can actually benefit the entire theatrical community. And so we continue to develop this tool. We did story circles with over 100 BIPOC practitioners. And then we did peer and professional review with people from Broadway veterans. I met Brian Stokes Mitchell, who was like the light and joy. He like turned on his camera when I came on the screen, and I was so excited by that. I was like, oh my goodness. But I got to like meet and interact with a lot of folks who were Broadway veterans and veterans from touring and regional companies. And I also got to interact with college age students and entry-level career practitioners. And we story circled with them. We did a peer and professional review where people looked over the assessment, gave their notes. Added augmentation. We did hours and hours and hours of talkbacks and fine tuning so that we were able to deliver the most succinct and also most comprehensive assessment program we could. And with the help of these BIPOC practitioners, we were able to develop our Joy Jackson assessment for systemic equity, where organizations can actively and accurately measure the impact that their social justice measures are having on their community. And that's for if they're at the beginning of their journey, they're just starting out, trying to figure out how their company and their business practices are affecting their theater community in their area, or if they've been doing this work for a long time, trying to assess whether their reach has impact. And we developed this assessment. And it's gone from a first cohort that just took the assessment, just did, the original data collection, to now we're seeking organizations to participate in our full rollout of the program, which includes monthly facilitation by trained facilitators who are trained in JJI's method of facilitation, also an assessment process. And we help organizations break down their data and recognize points of entry for them to be able to better serve the BIPOC practitioners in their communities.
So one of the things that we get in the arts a lot is a real lack of data, a real lack of specificity, and this idea that because we say something, it's true, right? If we repeat it enough,
right,
it's true.
Right, correct.
And so the work that you're doing in creating this assessment, you're giving people really a mirror to look at themselves and see if what they're saying really actually has actionable things.
Yeah, actionable impact, things that they can do.
Now, if I may, and I just want to ask this question directly, as a cisgendered, middle-aged white dude who grew up with a lot of privilege, right? And I've had a lot of fortunate experiences in my life. Can you give us some examples of things that happen to the BIPOC folks that I wouldn't necessarily be aware of?
Absolutely. So I'll give an example from my own life, and then I'll kind of stretch it out to a wider, broader stroke. Because I think it's important to also acknowledge the creative and activist lineage of the assessment of the Joy Jackson Initiative. The creators of We See You White American Theater and the We See You White American Theater list of demands was very integral in the process of creating our assessment. And so we roped in those demands, the demands of folks from colleges and universities across America. We roped in demands from multiple theater companies or multiple theater communities and multiple BIPOC practitioners to create this assessment. And so we've done a lot of work to understand understand what exactly people are going through and in turn what they need. And we use that information to help measure the systemic equity inside of these organizations, right? And so I can offer perspectives from my own viewpoint and also share some stories from other people's viewpoints as well that might not always clock to people who have not had my same lived experience as being Black at the intersections of Blackness and womanhood, right? And so for me personally, you see I'm wearing my little head wrap today. I love my head wraps, okay? And I was once, there was this twin day. We had a production of Parade, and we had twin day during the rehearsals because one of the wonderful women inside of our cast always did these cast bonding things for us. And so I was twins with this other girl, and we were both wearing head wraps that day. And it was actually this head wrap and like a little sweatshirt we had and some pants. And we had them done in like a little circle, little front bun. And one of the cast members, and like obviously didn't mean any harm by this, but it was a very like alarming moment, walked up to us and was like, "Oh, the Tubman twins," as in Harriet Tubman. And we were both like, and in that moment, it made us feel this big, both of us, because we looked at each other and we were like, wait, what? Were we just called enslaved people right now? And then not only that, but we didn't have anyone to report that instance of racism to. And so at the time, it was alarming because it was like, okay, we want to say something and we need to say something. We should say something. This made us deeply uncomfortable. But a lot of theater companies, especially smaller regional theaters, don't have HR, or if they do have HR, those HR people are not readily accessible. So there's no one to really report this instance of racism to, except maybe the stage manager. And the stage manager, as you all know, has a million things going on backstage and may not have time or bandwidth to create and process this request. And I will say also some of the assessment data, just to talk a little bit about numbers, most companies reported that they did have someone who cast members could report racial instances or instances of racial discrimination, right? Just like the one that I just talked about, which wasn't intentional, right? But it still made me and my counterpart feel very uncomfortable. And so instead of talking, so we, had to make a decision about whether we were going to talk to this person on our own or just kind of eat that remark, right? And a lot of the companies reported that there are people who cast members can report instances of racial discrimination to, but those people were the artistic director, those people were the producing director, those people were the managing directors, people in high positions of power, right? And not people whose job was, whose duties as assigned in their job descriptions, either they didn't have job descriptions for their duties, so all of these extra things are being lumped onto their plate. So of course, some of those smaller things and larger things are going to fall through the cracks, right? Or those same people did have those responsibilities, but were like people like pedestals of influence, right, inside of these organizations. And so there are people who are in really high places who you might not feel comfortable, whose door you might not feel comfortable knocking on, as someone who at the time, I think I had 2-3 years of experience by the time I was doing this show, and I didn't have the voice that I have today. And so I felt really uncomfortable. And for the rest of the run, I think we talked about that. And, there are instances like that one. There are instances like, we heard an errant N-word, the same production, we heard an errant N-word during one of the performances. And we as a cast of Black folks, because there was a Black cast and a white cast, we as a Black cast spent our 15-minute break. Instead of taking a break like our white counterparts, we spent 15 minutes of our time looking through the script to see if that N-word was actually in there. And when we found that it wasn't, we reported to stage management, and stage management didn't have a lot to do. There was a lot of
so in other words, you were told that the things that the people you could talk to were also the people that were going to be in charge of casting you in the next show.
Hello, yes, absolutely.
And so in other words, and then some of the subtext in that is, well, would you like to be hired again?
Yep.
Because the minute, and we all know this in this world of gigging where you're going from job to job, right? Part of the issue is that you have to be political and play the game and not cause trouble and all of those things that we're taught to be nice.
And you never want to be, another coded word, problematic.
Right.
You never want to be problematic. And for me, problematic has meant speaking up in instances of injustice, speaking up in times where I felt personally devalued or degraded, right? And so doing that makes you a problem, another coded word, right? Or a diva. We love to throw that word around. And when we're talking about Patti LuPone, being a diva has a very different instance than when we're talking about like Monique or someone like her, right? Because being a diva for Monique meant that she no longer had a career. Being a diva for Monique meant that she was blackballed from all of Oprah, Tyler Perry, all of these things, right? That she had been previously working on because she was a diva. But when we say a diva like Patti LuPone, we think of the time that she called out an audience member for using their phone during the performance. And we're like, what a heroic journey. But I urge you to think about how you would have felt about that, or how people would have felt about that if Audra McDonald had done the same thing.
Right. And I read recently in preparing for our discussion, Viola Davis talking about that she has exactly the same training as Meryl Streep, has exactly the same training as like Laura Linney, and is considered the finest actress, but she makes, I think she said something like 125th.
Yeah. If I may, I actually have an infographic about salaries. Yeah. So this is a problem across the board, right? We're talking about backstage, on stage, directors, all sorts of things, right? That we're seeing that people of color, specifically Black people as well, make significantly less, and Indigenous people as well. I wanted to be clear here. I'm going to pull this up and put it into presenter mode here. Can you all see that? Can you see my screen? Those famous words. You see these jarring numbers. Absolutely shocking, right? We have here that, you know, Indigenous folks on stage are making $0. This is from our last Joy Jackson Initiative assessment cohort. In our sample size, Indigenous folks made $0. And not because they were not paying Indigenous people, but because Indigenous people did not exist inside of the sample size of folks who were hired on stage, backstage, anywhere. The numbers across the board were 0. So I think that's important to note. Also, you'll notice that Black people, right, make up $21,525 of the last 5 years of our sample sizes salaries, right? When we see these numbers, right, and we see the comparison to white folks and other BIPOC folks, we see Black people are making more on average on stage than other BIPOC folks, because when you hire someone who is visibly Black, like myself, that you can call out instantaneously, oftentimes this is virtue signaling, right, for organizations. And what I mean by that is we are very clear in the theater industry, like you were saying earlier, that we are trying to make a change, right? And what I noticed is a trend, especially coming out of COVID-19, especially coming out of this time of racial unrest. People were programming things like Once on This Island or Parade, or, you know, any number of these shows that heavily feature Black artists inside of their theater spaces, because Black Lives Matter had just happened. The Black Lives Matter, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement had just happened. And so in order to show people that, oh, we have been listening, we know what you're talking about, we being the theater industry, programmed a lot of Black shows or Black driven shows intentionally in the beginning of our seasons to clearly state to folks outside that this is the direction that our theater is headed in now. But if we think about what that means in the long run, right? We think about the fact that COVID policies had not been tested yet before going back into the theaters. And so these shows featuring Black and BIPOC artists were the guinea pigs, right, for COVID policies. And if people were going to get sick, it was going to be those Black and Indigenous and people of color, practitioners of color, who were going to be entering spaces first. And so they were most at risk, right? They were put most at risk for being sick. But even here, you see that other BIPOC folks, like Asian folks, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, like people who do not identify as Black, Hispanic folks, Latino folks, right? These people were not hired, or were not hired as often as clearly stated by the salaries, right, as Black people, because when you see a visibly Black person like myself on stage, there's not a lot of ambiguity about what my racial background is, right? You look at me, you're like, ah, that's a Black woman, she's from the African diaspora. Like, no matter what my ethnicity is, you can see that, like, oh, that is a Black woman. Like, and so organizations visually use us and our bodies as a cue to other people that look at us, look at how we've changed, look at what we've done, right? So that's what those numbers say to me. But regardless, right, regardless of what virtue signaling is happening here, it is very, very, very clear that not only are white actors being hired at a greater, like at a higher number, right, but also they're being paid exponentially more than the Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or practitioners of color who are coming into these organizations, right? And they are being compensated at a much, much higher rate. And again, I want to stress that people who identify as Native or Indigenous, there were $0 spent. And so these numbers translate directly to financial capacities for these folks who are in this theater industry, right? And so across the board, just like you were saying before, people are being paid less. And Viola Davis, clearly, Viola Davis is not telling any sort of falsehood, right? These numbers are staggering, and it happens across the board. Later on, we'll talk about directors and people behind the table, and I'll show you some of those numbers as well. It is, and it doesn't mean that people aren't being hired. It just means that people aren't necessarily being paid the way that they should be.
And in another conversation I was having, and as I'm learning and investigating, that a lot of salaries in the theater community are kept secret, right? And we don't know how much, I'm going to use, since Tim is standing here, sitting there, how much a lighting designer gets paid across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And do certain lighting designers get, and we keep that so we can keep everybody literally in the dark, right? In the dark. But really, this is all across the industry in performing all over.
Yeah.
Right? Is that all salaries are secretive. How people get rehired or not rehired. And there's been an interesting shift for me watching, I'm not going to say the name of the opera company, but it's in New York and it's large. How pre-pandemic you would look across the stage and you would not see even if the opera is set in China, you would not see a Chinese singer.
Not to say that you wouldn't see people representing Chinese people, right?
Right.
With yellow face as well, right?
Well, and I can tell you, having been in a production of Secret Garden back when I was in my early 20s, and the women of India were orange.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And
common practice.
It is. And I want to say, well, we didn't know better, but we did.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in it, and I look back at that and going, oh my gosh, what was anybody thinking?
Right. But it's so easy to be complicit in these systems of oppression and injustice, right?
Mhm.
And oftentimes those systems will target people who are sometimes left-leaning, and really kind of unsure about the moral gray area of certain things, and will latch on to things. For instance, I was just listening to a person by the screen name of Pink Manta Ray on Instagram, talking about how left-wing feminists are often pulled into the movement for the delusion of white supremacy, by saying things like, we have to protect women's sports. And often this anti-trans rhetoric is sort of coded, right, as feminism, as protecting women, when in actuality, in order to protect women, we have to protect all women, right? And inclusion and including all women is the way forward towards that, right? And so seeing that really like brought some light to that for me as well, like being clear about what the moral gray area that you see is, and being willing to be not a bystander but an upstander and step into that moral gray area and say, hey, this feels uncomfortable for me, or hey, I'm noticing a pattern of us doing this thing, or even just what you did right now, admitting to wrongdoing or admitting to being complicit inside of a system and saying, this is important to me to cop to own. I want to change it. I want to grow from this. How can I move forward in this space? So I think that, continuing to have these tough conversations is one of the ways that we can continue to move the needle forward.
Mhm.
And honestly, everybody says progress is slow. That's not, though. It's not, right? Because we progressed and we changed in order to maintain capitalist systems, and specifically capitalist systems of oppression that keep people in poverty, right? We shifted very quickly to
Right.
ensure that we could continue that oppression, right? And so when systems benefit those who are in power, change happens quickly. But when systems go directly against people who are in power, those systems change very, very slowly, and often at the cost of lives, blood, sweat, and tears, and mostly from the people who are being oppressed by these systems.
It what you're saying is so powerful and so important. And I want to ask a further question.
Yes.
There is a sense in a very real gatekeeping methodology within performance, right? In the world of music, the world of theater, the world of dance,
Right.
that starts very early. In other words, getting those music lessons and stuff early sets you up to have more chance of success.
Yeah.
Right. And those studios and all of that stuff tends to only happen in the rich white suburbs.
Yeah.
And so that by itself is setting up those kids to be better prepared for auditions for colleges, to get into, to know how to navigate that system of auditioning and having the pictures and having all of that.
Absolutely.
The work that you're doing, how do you see, and has there been any discussion, because you're dealing at very professional levels and you're dealing with the people that are already in the theater world.
Yeah.
How does this work translate to even earlier?
Yeah, so we actually have designed the assessment specifically to be able to adapt itself to any number of organizational models, right? From early education, early theater education. Actually, a part of our last cohort was a small dance troupe, dance and performance troupe that actually educates my little sister, for whom the Joy Jackson Initiative was named, Kayla Joy Smith. And so we have adapted the we've created the assessment to be adaptable to all of those varied organizational models, right? From companies who are running at full capacity with large boards, large staff, large leadership structures, and multiple shows a season, to small educational institutions and early educational institutions, colleges, universities, all sorts of places that can kind of take the assessment in ways that allows it to be sort of a la carte and choose, which pieces of their organization or which pieces of the assessment will be for their organization. So that's the way the assessment itself works. But as far as our advocacy, right, we are dedicated to ensuring that performers of all ages, all racial backgrounds, all abilities and all genders and sexual identities are able to thrive inside of the theater space, right? And so in order to do that, we do have to kind of get down to the core. And I do, briefly want to pay homage to folks like Debbie Allen starting Dada, right? And Lula Washington School of Dance, and Alvin Ailey's youth programs, right? Who are serving intentionally youth of color and specifically Black youth, right? In underserved communities. And I want to give that credit to them and say, that while yes, overwhelmingly the large majority of, suburban white neighborhoods are the places where people must go to train, and this gatekeeping that happens is often gatekeeping that surrounds body politics, right? You're too fat to be a dancer, you're too dark to be a dancer. For instance, also there's a printed, and this was horrific to learn for me, but there's a printed interview where the woman who was the choreographer for many, many years for the Rockettes said that there would never be a dark-skinned leg down the Rockette line because it just wouldn't match up with the choreography, because the dancers need to move as one body and the body must look the same. That is documented. I believe it's in the New York Times. And she said that in print in an interview. That is how rampant the racism is inside of the theater industry. And it does start, as you were saying, with these youth programs, right? Where we're policing bodies of young children. We're policing hair. I was told that if I couldn't get my hair into the slick back bun, I wasn't going to be able to continue to take ballet classes. So, and my hair, you can't see it now, but it is very thick, very curly. And sometimes that slick back bun doesn't work for me, right? And so it's important to understand that this body policing and these body politics, even translating now into this attack on young trans youth, right, and their ability to play sports with folks who match their gender, right? Like this attack on trans youth, that is even a piece, right, that the power structure has latched onto to be able to continue these systems of oppression that keep specifically Black, because a lot of this is rooted in anti-Blackness, even the like anti-fat, fat shaming, body shaming politics, right? We think back to Sarah Barton. We think back to that original body type that's when bustles came around, right? We see bustles, an explosion of bustles on women's bodies, right, to imitate this look, because Black people have always been the culture, okay? Even enslaved Black people have always been the culture, all right? But we also see that body policing and corsets, like a real live look at the way that we treat women's bodies and demonize specifically women's bodies, and it translates over to men too, right? And so a lot of this comes from anti-Blackness and comes from a demonization of features generally associated with Black bodies, like booties, okay?
Mhm.
So
Well,
those things
yeah.
yeah.
I just, the more you talk, the more I'm hearing that this is what you're doing, is you have sounded the alarm,
Mhm.
right, on behalf of the Black community and all peoples of brown, Black, right,
Mhm.
indigenous folks. And you're also saying that there's all of these other people as well
Yeah.
that have been completely shut out.
Yes.
And you said something, and you know, where the bodies don't align,
Mhm.
right, where they don't fit in. And I think of, you know, people that I know that have been told, oh, you're to this,
Yeah.
you'll never make because of this.
Mhm.
And you have been shut out of so many opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you are really taking up the mantle
Yeah.
of not being quiet and obedient and nice,
Yeah.
and really giving voice to these things in spaces that are not comfortable for you,
Yeah.
and that you are spending your time having uncomfortable conversations,
Yeah.
right? Because this is, none of this is easy.
No, I mean, it's gotten easier over time. And I also just want to like stop us here and just be clear that, you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, go together.
Mhm.
There are so many people along this journey that have helped not only me in shaping my leadership capacities, but also have helped shaping the vision of the Joy Jackson Initiative and have helped shape the direction in which we're going. I want to call in Black Theater Girl Magic, Mandy Jo John, Heather Ensley, and Kyla Carter, who have been instrumental in the shaping of JJI's assessment. I want to say thank you to Affect, uh, um, uh, founded by Karen Olivo and who goes by KO now, and
Mhm.
Eden Espinoza,
Mhm.
Broadway for Racial Justice. Brandon Michael Nace has been super instrumental in helping us get the word out about what the Joy Jackson Initiative is, how our assessment works, what things do. So, I am doing what I can to pull at my individual thread, but everybody has to pull at their own thread, right? And everybody also has to help when we hit a snag. We all have to help pull at each other's
Mhm.
threads as well. And
Mhm.
so I'm not, I don't represent my own ideas solely, right? I represent a collection of ancestry. I represent a collection of influence. I represent a collection of thought processes, right? That have shaped me and molded me and shaped my organization and molded my organization, and the team at JJI who has supported this vision from the ground up, right? So when we say that, I'm sounding the alarm, it's not me, it's the team, right? And we are all continuously working together in concert, and creating, and Black Theater Coalition and BTU, Black Theater United. All of these organizations have been instrumental in creating what JJI has become and have shaped our vision for the future and what we want to do, you know. So I just want to flag that first. And then I want to also say that, yes, I have been tapped out of many opportunities because of the color of my skin, because of the shape of my body, but also tokenism and exceptionalism inside of the spaces that I occupy, because I'm often the only Black face in a predominantly white space. Those things have afforded me kind of a disgusting privilege, right? Because it's like, oh, oftentimes people want to pedal me out because, of my Blackness and because of the diversity factor that I add to their organizations, right? And so oftentimes I am propped up as a token of representation. And so oftentimes I get opportunities to do things that I would not normally get to do. And so I have been afforded great privilege in my life by being one of many, one of few in a space of many, right? And so I just want to acknowledge that privilege as well, moving forward in this conversation, and be very clear that, I recognize that a lot of things have happened on my own talent and merit, and a lot of things have happened for me because, I happen to be a Black face in a predominantly white space, and people really, really, really want people to see that Black face. So I just want to be clear about that and acknowledge that, and also acknowledge the fact that I am dark skinned and I am a Black woman, and say that, those things, the intersections of those two things, while they often do create opportunity, they also create disproportionate oppression to my white counterparts and my light skinned Black counterparts, right? Because colorism is real, colorism is prevalent. Colorism is what got Meghan Markle into the royal family, and racism is what shut her out, right? So essentially, being light skinned is a privilege, and I do not have that privilege, right? And so I just want to be very clear about my intersections and be very clear about my lived experience as well.
Yeah, I think that's so important to put context into that, because it's an example of how we all have to look at our privilege, and how we all have to examine that our context is sometimes what gives us an advantage, right? Context is important.
Yeah.
So I want to, in a very simple direction. So when you're giving the assessment, and what is one of the things that an organization is asked?
Oh man, so we have a myriad of different sections. We ask questions related to a few different categories, though. Policies and practices, which examine organizations like written policy and cultural practices, right? Because there's a lot of policy that happens, inside of like employee handbooks and things like that. But there's also the unwritten and unspoken cultural context of community, right? And this happens in all communities, but specifically in professional settings, a lot of the time, these unwritten rules of engagement kind of rule the way that we interact with each other on the whole, right? And so we examine companies' policies that are written and their practices that are unwritten and kind of mutually agreed upon, and sometimes not. Practices that exist in sort of the shadows, right? We examine ideals and culture. Generally speaking, we have the leadership of the organization taking these assessments, and these ideals and culture sections are designed to kind of measure the understanding around some of these larger topics, right? Breaking them down into smaller pieces and examining bit by bit the understanding of the people in leadership who are creating this culture, examining how much they know and also how they use what they know, right? Because that's a huge point of the practice, right? And also seeing like, hey, you believe this thing, when we're doing our facilitation, your leadership and your employee pool, because we distribute the ideals and culture section inside of our facilitation at every facilitation meeting. We do one meeting a month with the whole group, and one small group meeting with the leadership who is going to be present and making the decisions on how these companies move forward, right? But that leadership is fueled by the organization that they're leading, right? The people inside of that org. So your leadership believes this thing, your employee pool believes this thing. These are where those are different, right? How can we make these ideals come together to serve the greatest purpose of equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? And then we have financial sections where we measure in plain terms who's making what and how those numbers demographically show up. I just showed you some of the data from some of those sections. Alarming, right? And really easy to see when it's put into plain focus. And then we also ask questions just about data collection, right? How many people do you have behind the scenes as lighting designers? How many Black people do you have as lighting designers? How many Indigenous people? You know, we're using you, Tim. We're using you all day long. So how many people, and we also asked the question, and this was so hotly debated. And I was like, why wouldn't we do this? Why would I want to do the math? Why would I want to do extra work? We also asked how many white people you have at your organization, because people are like, why would you even count that? Just everybody else that isn't that. Like, because girl, you need to report that too. You need to tell us that too. You know, so we have those data ranges. So and we really are able to kind of dismantle not only data and numbers, financial data, right? But also like the data, we've found a way to really put into numbers and put into percentages how people think and measure in a real concrete and actionable way how company culture is affected by not only policies, unwritten practices, but also the ideals and values of the people leading that culture. So it's a really all-encompassing, and we do things like backstage, on stage. We ask questions about casting. We ask questions about you know, people behind the scenes, all sorts of different disciplines. And we tried to cover the widest range that we could, from artistic directors all the way to scenic designers, all the way to people who are on the technical crews for individual shows and things like that. So it's a lot of data, but the rate, and everybody's like, oh, but this must take so long, you know, people aren't going to be willing to participate. You were willing to participate in racism for the last, what are we on, year 402, 403? Yeah, since people were brought over on ships. So I think we can probably spend like 2, 3, 4 months, you know, trying to figure out how those 400 years have affected our companies and our worldview.
I also think by looking at data, when you look at people's finances, you see their priorities.
Yeah, and their values very plainly.
If you look at my checking account, you're going to see how much I love DoorDash, right? you're gonna see that, right? Because that is something I value. You know, that is something. It's a priority.
Yeah.
So you're talking more than, oh, we should program The Wiz next season.
Talking way more about programming, if I may, actually.
Please.
So when we talk about programming seasons, I love to get into the nitty gritty. And one of the best ways to get into that is director data. I think this is one of the most interesting data points in our entire assessment, because people program these shows, right? And they're like, we're going to do The Wiz, and we're going to do some other work from the 80s or the 60s or the 30s that has
or hair. Yeah.
Or hair. Ugh,
yeah, let's do
we're
that.
going to do an all Black cast of Romeo and Juliet. Never mind the fact that there are living playwrights, such as myself, who are currently writing new works for Black, Indigenous, and practitioners of color, right? So never mind that. But I love to look at the director data, because it's very, very clear, even when we're programming these seasons, like, we're going to do an all Black production of Shakespeare. It's going to be great. Everyone that you see on stage is going to be Black. But what will the people behind the table and on creative teams look like? And how is that reflective of who you value and who you trust to helm things inside of your organization? I'm going to bring up 2 data points here. Okay, so we're talking about directors specifically because I think this is really indicative of who organizations trust to do the work of their org, right? Who organizations really think are capable, because this is about capability, right? Direction is about capability. You're not just going to choose anyone to helm your season. When we look at the data on directors hired by organizations, we see that those hired to helm works at theaters in our sample size were usually white. We also see that there were no Indigenous directors of any theater at any of the theaters in our cohort for their last 5 seasons. This is 5-year data here. And you'll see that only 7.2% of folks were non-Black POC, right? 15.9% of folks who were directing shows were Black. 76.8% of people who were hired to helm works at these organizations were white. Those numbers are astounding, overwhelming. And a lot of these shows had program seasons with Black, Indigenous, and practitioners of color, right? So we see this, we're looking at this, we're like, wow, this is interesting. We go to the data also here. Let me see if I can scroll to the next one. There it is. So this one, hold on, let's see here. Did I move? There we go. So we see directors of classical works. These are the people we trust to helm things like Shakespeare, like The Seagull, right? We see classical works, the directors are 100% white, because these are also considered theater canon, right? When we think of the theater canon, and we think specifically of these shows that are the foundation, the basis on which American and British theater are founded, right? So 100% of those properties, 100% of those properties were helmed by white individuals. But we know where to find the BIPOC folks when it comes to helming BIPOC driven works. It's not that we don't know where to find the directors for the classical works. Clearly we do. 70.8% of people who helmed works that were BIPOC driven were Black. 20% were BIPOC and 8.3% were white. And I just want to flag too that no Indigenous directors were trusted to lead works of any kind at the theaters in our sample sizes, right? All of this translates directly to salaries. While we see that 70.8% of the BIPOC driven works were directed by Black people, how many dollars were those Black directors paid? 0. While $33,200 were paid to white directors of classical works. Scott, you said that it's clear to see where people value. If 100% of the directors of classical works were white, and 100% of those white directors got paid, we can clearly see that we put the most value on works that are classical or deemed classical, and the people who are helming those works are our most important priority. The people helming Black works, clearly not prioritized. And I want to be clear, the reason that I singled out Black and Indigenous folks is present in this data right here. Because oftentimes the proximity to whiteness of other BIPOC folks that has been bestowed upon these people unwillingly by the delusion of white supremacy to allow the numbers of whiteness to grow. For example, I was sitting in a meeting and a man, straight-faced, asked me if Asian people were still considered BIPOC. Aren't they white now, he said? Because whiteness, the delusion of white supremacy, insists upon growing its numbers in order to maintain its power. And in order to do that, it affords the privileges of whiteness oftentimes to people who are lighter skinned and people who have that closer proximity to whiteness. Black directors were not afforded these things, right? Indigenous directors were not afforded these privileges. Other BIPOC folks, though, who have earned or unwillingly earned that proximity to whiteness in order to have whiteness grow its numbers, to maintain the power that it has a chokehold on this theater industry, right? In order to maintain that chokehold, we're offered certain and afforded certain privileges.
You can direct Dream Girls.
Hey,
You can direct The Wiz.
you can direct any of the number of Black shows we program in February.
Right, Smokey Joe's Cafe, and we're not gonna pay you.
No. What an honor it is to work for our theater.
You should, what great exposure you're going to get.
You know what doesn't pay my bills though? Those exposure coupons.
No, it doesn't.
People
do
died
anything.
of exposure on the old trails, didn't they? That's what I remember, but that's just me. But yeah, I get fired up about this though, because I think, people are alarmed when I start to get amplified, right? When I start to get activated, people become a little bit alarmed because it feels like anger and it feels like possessiveness or scarcity mindset. In actuality, I don't think that a person who is empathetic, kind, has leadership ability can look at those numbers and not feel activated and not feel immediately like they want to do something, because those numbers translate to those artists that they were not paying and their ability to eat. And the privilege that it requires to be able to work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and not have to get paid for that is not a privilege that Black, Indigenous, people of color have been afforded in this country because of redlining, because of intentional wage stagnation, because of intentional division of labor and work resources, right? Because of intentional ghettoizing, right? Because of intentional demonizing, because of intentional politicizing of Black and brown bodies, because of intentional politicizing of even the way my hair grows out of my head. We had to recently have a bill enacted that says that it is illegal for employers to discriminate based on the hairstyle we are wearing, right? That bill came into being in 2018, I believe, the Crown Act, 2018 or 2019. We have again been inside of these systems of oppression since the first enslaved person was trafficked across the ocean. These systems of oppression have existed far before that, with the erasure and murdering and intentional I'm trying to think of the word right now, but the intentional erasure of Indigenous lives on this soil, right? So these systems of oppression have existed for far longer than we have been even, trying to fight our way out of bondage. And as we continue the fight, and I hope that the Joy Jackson Initiative and our assessment can be a part of what comes next, what happens next, and what leads us to the future. And I hope eventually someone looks at my work and says, how outdated, how horrific that they were doing this kind of thing.
We don't need to do that anymore because it's solved, right?
I hope that somebody thinks my work is offensive. I hope that somebody thinks my work is so outdated it's offensive. That's how far beyond I want to go.
Mm-hmm. Gabby, we're at the end of our time, and I am even more inspired by the work that you're challenging all of us to do, because I'm thinking that this application and this assessment goes beyond just a professional theater, but into education, into music. I mean, I'm thinking I was trying to name a professional conductor, a Black conductor, and I could of a major orchestra, I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking there's so much work, and there's so much work that we can do. And I thank you for sharing your time as always. And thank you for being part of this as we at Saddleback ask these questions. And how do we as people of thinking, how do we put actionable data? How do we use this? How do we change so that we can make sure that whatever gatekeeping we do, that we can we can remove the gate,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we think of all of the things that are set up just through an audition process,
Yeah.
just through a rehearsal schedule that can be really problematic. And we're all well-intentioned, but we have to do this work. So thank you for bringing it to us. And this will be distributed to all of our arts instructors and into all of our staff. And I would like to bring you back.
I would love to come back. Would love to come back. I would love to facilitate for Saddleback in the future. I'd love that. And also, I just want to make a note too here, because you mentioned something really important. It starts at the very beginning, right? These things start from casting notices. These things start from classes offered. These things start from the foundation up. These things start from rehearsal schedules and being clear about who we want to invite into these spaces, because we've been so clear about who we want to keep out, right? And ensuring that we make things equitable for everybody, not just across race, not just across gender, but also people who have childcare needs, people who are unable to, miss working for 4 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, however long this rehearsal process is, people who need to be able to both provide for themselves and want to learn more in an educational setting, right? And figuring out how to set up systems that serve the least of these, right? Because oppression is kind of like a ladder, right? If you take the bottom rung out of a ladder, that ladder falls apart. So if we start from the bottom rung, who is the least of these, and how can we take them out of, how can we take them out of bondage? That's really where things begin.
Great. Thank you, Gabby, so very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you.